What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive back into Arena, and I kind of am going to be diving into a couple more budget decks that I've been kind of working through, kind of trying to figure out what are some other budget decks that you could kind of prepare for, possibly for rotation coming in the next couple of weeks. I believe in Arena it will be on September 1st is kind of what I've been hearing. I actually haven't seen any confirmation of whether or not it is. But if, I hear people talking about it, especially prominent people in the Magic Arena scene, I'd assume that means that a rotation is closer than it is further, which is definitely awesome. Though I do think the set comes out a week later at that point. But still, nonetheless, definitely something that, in these next couple of weeks, we definitely want to get prepared for. I know they definitely dropped a big summer sale here in MTG Arena. I guess maybe for people that may have been saving currency and maybe spend on some cosmetics. But with that out of the way, I mean, I kind of went ahead and I created 3 new decks that I definitely do think could be a decent starting place if you're looking to play a couple different archetypes come post-rotation. 2 of them are kind of similar in one sense, but, one's more of a tribal deck than the other, so that's kind of where the big difference is. But with that out of the way, let's just dive into the first deck and let's just start talking about it. So the first deck up here on the list is going to be a Boros Artifacts style deck. Now, this is definitely a deck that I've seen pop up here and there, but, it's definitely something that could still be pretty good for post-rotation. And then on top of that, with the Brothers War possibly being an artifact set, it's definitely a deck that could gain some more cards from when that comes out in the near future. And it's definitely kind of good to maybe have some sort of deck kind of in your back pocket of what you could possibly make in the time being, and maybe just kind of get you there for the most part. And the other thing too, this deck is definitely very low curve. I actually would say most of the decks today are very low curve. They're not very expensive in the sense that the top end cards usually no more than 3 or 4. In this example, the top end card is Angel Fire Ignition, which starts out at 3 and then becomes 4 if you flash it back from the graveyard. But nonetheless, this is definitely a pretty low to the ground kind of style artifact deck, and it doesn't really cost too much to really get going. The one downside is with Pathways rotating out is that we do lose out on having untapped lands that create one of both colors. So we are unfortunately having to play slow lands, which are the rare versions of the dual lands, and then also playing the tapped dual lands just for the time being until you can get yourself I guess a set of Sundown Passes if you don't already have one. Outside of that, there really is no other way for us to make white or red mana outside of these kind of options. So this is kind of what we're stuck with. And I only went with the 1 copy because I believe you get this one from, the starter deck that is red-white. So you should have one of these already if you don't already have it from that starter deck. But nonetheless, this deck is just, like I said, very low to the ground. It's actually pretty decent, especially if you get a pretty decent hand going. We do have a lot of 1-drops in the deck. We have a decent amount of 2-drops, and then, like I said, the Angel Fire Ignition is kind of that top end. I have Synthesizer in here just a little bit as a card draw that can also create a creature if you really, really need one desperately. But definitely not a bad card in that sense. I do like the kind of a synergy it has. You definitely want to make sure you have mana to play whatever you make top deck, or possibly you have the ability to play a land just because you don't want to waste the card you're exiling because it does go away at the end of turn. And then on top of it, like I said, you can always sink mana into it and sacrifice it to actually get a Samurai token, or this would be a target that you could use for like a Voltage Surge sacrifice if you need to kind of, sacrifice an artifact to do 4 damage to target creature. We got Gold Down in here because, one, it's the treasure itself, so you can sacrifice it as treasure. It also is a First Strike Menace, which is definitely very good. Definitely pretty decent to kind of mix that with our Mashako's Reign of Truth. So definitely a good card there. A little bit of a mana ramp for 1 mana, so it's still not too bad. We have Kamano in the deck. I think this is going to be a card you're going to see in a lot of aggro decks in red or that play red. It's just a very good 1-drop that kind of does a lot. The fact that it deals 1 point of damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control is pretty good. Chapter 2 is definitely very good if you're trying to be aggressive, getting a +1/+1 counter on any creature that enters the battlefield on that turn. And the 3rd chapter is you get the 2/2 that makes anything that a creature would be dealt damage this turn by a source of control would die, you exile it. So it definitely removes those things that when they die, they get some sort of trigger. So definitely overall pretty good card. And I think it works kind of well in this kind of style of deck, even though it's not an artifact. We have Play with Fire here as a little bit extra spot removal, or 2 to the face if you want to do it that way to get a scry out of it. But yet again, just kind of trying to play a little bit of mixture of some removal and some a little bit of ways to kind of keep the board into our favor, just because we really don't want our opponent to kind of ramp up and also play big things on us. So definitely always good to have some way of doing damage to their face. We also have Rabbit Battery in the deck as a 1 mana 1/1 haster. We can equip it to a creature, give that creature +1/+1 and haste itself for only paying 1 additional mana to reconfigure, which is essentially just a weird way of saying equip, but it's not technically an equipment because it's a creature, so I guess they renamed it, but still not a bad card. Nonetheless, I did experiment with the Samurai that's a 2/2 for one, that's an artifact creature that gets bounced back to your hand at the end of turn. That can also then be channeled to draw a card. It's definitely an interesting card, but you definitely don't want to play more of those if you want to play that card as well. It's just kind of one of those things that sometimes you're in a weird spot. You don't want to have to keep on playing a 2/2. It's always good to have stuff that just kind of sticks, and that's why I kind of went with Rabbit Battery over that card. But still, you can always play around, maybe with mixing in how many quantities of each you'd want. Voltage Surge makes the list, as this is being the best removal that if you're playing an artifact-focused deck to have in, just because for 1 mana, you can do 2 damage to each 2 target creature or planeswalker. And then you can, for an additional cost, we can sacrifice an artifact and deal 4 damage instead. So definitely for 1 mana, possibility of doing 4 damage by sacrificing an artifact is definitely very good. And we have outlets in the deck that we can sacrifice to this effect if we really need to actually do that 4 points of damage. And then of course, because we are playing an artifact deck, Iron Apprentice makes the list as being a 1 mana 0/0 that enters battle with a +1/+1 counter on it. And then when it would die, if it had if it had counters on it, you get to put get to put those counters onto another target creature you control. So very interesting plays. You play this after a Kamano on the second chapter. It comes in as a 2/2, and then if this dies, now you can put 2 +1/+1 counters on another creature, which is definitely very good. And still, just even if it's a 1/1 that eventually puts that 2 counters, that 1 counter somewhere else, still not bad overall for our deck. In the 2-drop slot, we have Machako's Reign of Truth being kind of the big card in the deck outside of the Angel Fire Ignition that kind of gives target creature +1/+1 to end a turn for each artifact and/or enchantment we control. We do control a fair amount of both, so definitely not that bad there. It's 2 chapters of that, and then we get the creature that does the same exact thing on the creature itself. So this could come on the battlefield after the 3 chapters as maybe like a 4/4 or 5/5, which is still definitely very awesome. And it only costs 2 mana to get this going, and this is definitely going to be a way for us in the early game to put a lot of pressure on our opponent once we kind of get a little bit of a board state going. Then we have Dragon Spark Reactor. Yet again, I feel like another good card for an artifact-based deck. It's good in Anvil. I feel like it's good here. 2 mana artifact that whenever it or another artifact enters the battlefield under control, we get to put a charge counter on it, which is a good ability. And then for 4 mana, we can sacrifice it. It deals damage equal to the number of charge counters on it to target player, and that much damage to up to 1 target creature. So if we get this going up to 4 or 5, even higher, depending on how many artifacts we played before it or after it, we can do a lot of damage, kind of finish off our opponent like that. And worst case scenario, we have to just target one of our creatures with the effect just so that we can do that point of damage to our opponent's face. And still not a bad card to kind of finish off our opponent at a budget state. Kami's Flare makes the list, as there's a lot of ways for us to modify our creatures that do 2 mana, 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and then it also deals 2 damage to that permanent controller if we control a modified creature. So pretty good removal for this style of deck. Then we also have Patchwork Automaton, probably the best 2-drop for artifacts currently, as being a 2 mana 1/1 with Ward 2. Makes it hard to get rid of in the early game, and then whenever we cast an artifact spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on the Automaton, and essentially it kind of grows throughout the game. So they really aren't able to remove it unless they somehow either, something like a Meathook Massacre very early before this starts growing, or they have to kind of wait until that later game so they have the 2 additional mana to play for that direct removal. So pretty awesome in that sense. And like I said, kind of to round it out, we have Angel Fire Ignition here as being a 3 mana, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Haste to end a turn. So you put on something like a Patchwork Automaton if it's pretty decently sized. Now it has Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Haste, so now it gets attacking pretty aggressively. And it doesn't even have to tap, and it gets to keep those 2 +1/+1 counters, and then the next turn we can follow that up and play it again if they don't remove Angel Fire from the graveyard. So definitely a good card to kind of round out the deck nonetheless. Then, like I said, the mana base is pretty straightforward. We are only playing 22 lands here, 7 plains, 10 mountains, 4 of the Windscarred Crags, and 1 Sundown Pass. Overall, it's definitely going to be tough mana-wise for any aggressive deck, just because all the dual lands in current standard and possibly post-standard will come into play tapped, which kind of slows down those more aggressive decks. So definitely not really. It's going to be one of those things that you could eventually upgrade in Sundown Passes, just because in the later turns this comes in battlefield untapped. But early on, if you're still working on getting some wild cards, I mean, Windscarred Crags are still not bad replacements. So definitely not bad there. And then I kind of have in the sideboard a couple possible upgrades if you want to kind of add this to, and kind of maybe, fluctuate depending on how, the overall meta shifts and whatnot. So first card up, we have Lion Sash. Definitely a good card here. It's a 1 mana exile target card from graveyard. If it was a permanent card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and then equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each +1/+1 counter on Lion Sash, and you can reconfigure it for 2 mana. And it's definitely gonna be one of those things. It's definitely not bad to have in the deck. It's not a necessity, just because maybe your opponent's not really playing any things that's gonna return from the graveyard. But it's definitely not bad if maybe you get stuck up against a Reanimator deck or something like that, or if they have cards that have Flashback or The other ability that begins with C, I can't think of the top of my head. But if they have that, you can get rid of those cards, possibly get this bigger, and it's a creature itself, so we'll get the +1/+1 counters itself. And then worst case scenario, if you want to protect it, if they don't have any direct removal, you can equip it on a creature. So then those +1/+1 counters help buff one of your creatures. Yeah, like I said, you probably want to place one of the 2-drops. Maybe you get rid of Reactor, put a Lion Sash, as this is another way to put some mana sink. As if you have open mana, you can put that open mana into exiling things from the graveyard, so they just can't get it back. Lizard Blades makes the list. And again, another good kind of reconfigure card, 2-mana artifact creature, equipment lizard that has double strike. And then if you equip it to a creature, it gives it double strike. So definitely not a bad thing to put on our automaton. Combine that with Angel Fire Ignition, kind of turns Angel Fire Ignition and whatever creature it has equipped into almost like an Embercleave in a way, which is definitely very good. Only being 2 mana and 2 mana to equip it, still not bad yet again. Maybe you want to play this and kind of replace maybe, it's definitely tough to really think about what you want to replace to add this. But you can always replace maybe a couple of the rabbit batteries. It doesn't have haste. It does cost 1 more mana. But, it's one of those things you got to kind of find your places to kind of figure out where you want to cut in order to add cards when it comes to things like that. And then we also have Unlicensed Hearst. I think this is definitely not a bad card to add to a deck because, yet again, it's a vehicle that's essentially an artifact for the most point. But at the end of every turn, we can exile up to 2 cards from a graveyard. And then its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards exiled with it. So kind of another way for us to kind of eat our opponent's graveyard. And then we only have to tap it we can crew it for 2, so we don't really have to put a lot of power into it to actually turn it on. And then we can attack in as another way to kind of finish off our opponent. Definitely another good, target possibly for Angel Fire Ignition. So not a bad equipment or bad vehicle that works very well with the deck, especially if we're worried about things in our opponent's graveyard. Definitely another good card to kind of have in the deck if you want to, target a graveyard and prevent your opponent from possibly taking things out of it and then recasting them. And then, like I said, the rest of the upgrades, I would say, would be a Ganjo. You could add 1 or 2 copies of this. Probably don't need more than 1 or 2. One, it's a legendary land, so you can only have 1 of them out. But the channel ability is not that bad as kind of being a spot removal, and it takes a land slot, so it's definitely cool to, in the late game, if you draw one of these, it's not really a waste of a card, as you can kind of use as a removal spell. Sokuzen, Crucible of the Defiance, another good legendary land. You probably want 1 in the deck, maybe 2 at most. But you discard it, and you get to create 2 1/1 color spirit tokens. They gain haste and end turn. So definitely not a bad land as well. But like I said, these lands aren't needed. It just kind of gives basic mountains and plains a little bit extra effect in case you draw them in the later game. So kind of like one of those things you want to upgrade last in the deck. But it's always good to have maybe 1 or 2 in your collection nonetheless if you decide to play red or black, or red or white in the future. And then the last land here is going to be Sundown Pass. Slowly building your way into having a set of these. Having dual lands are always a good thing in most metas, just because this allows you to be flexible with your mana. It is a little bit slow for an aggro deck, but unfortunately this is the best option we have post-rotation, but still not bad, and you slowly replace the Windscarred Crags and maybe keep 1 Windscarred Crag in there, or add maybe an additional 1 if you feel like you're getting weird with mana and you're not drawing enough of either color. But like I said, this is going to replace the Windscarred Crag, so overall, still not bad of a list. Definitely very low to the ground, very budget-friendly, I would say, even with upgrades. Just because the cards you're going to upgrade, you're probably going to only want to add 1 or 2 additional copies of them. You're not going to want a full set for the most part. But nonetheless, Boros Artifacts, cool kind of archetype. Hopefully gets better with, like I said, the Brothers War when it comes out. As hopefully that's got a pretty decent artifact set. But nonetheless, definitely a cool list to check out and maybe kind of see where you're at collection-wise and see how close you are to building it. So the next deck up on the list is another deck that is kind of interesting here, and I'm not sure if I actually covered this before, but yet again, it's a mono blue Delver deck. It's another archetype that I feel like you could play in post-rotation. It's a pretty decent archetype right now with Delver. I think, not Luminarch Aspirant, Delver with Ascendant Spirit. Definitely a good archetype. It's a very tempo-heavy deck. You're not trying to tap out every turn. You're trying to play a little bit, leave some mana open so you can kind of interact with what happens on the board. Another deck that's very low to the ground. It's also very budget friendly because it is only 1 color, so really the lands for the most part are blue mana. You can upgrade into the rare lands from Kamigawa, but you don't need a full set of them. So definitely a very low to the ground deck, and I think the one rare that I did focus on having here is going to be the Ledger Shredder. I think this is a good card for this style of deck because in itself is kind of a tempo card. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, it connives, so we get to draw a card and discard a card. So we either discard a non-land card and we get a +1/+1 counter, or we discard a land card if we have just a bunch of extra lands. So it kind of helps fix our hand. And it's a very good tempo card in the sense that it kind of allows us to kind of draw kind of through our deck and find answers depending on what the board state is. So definitely a good card in that sense. But nonetheless, the deck is, like I said, low to the ground. You know, we're playing just a lot of quick, cheap spells that don't really cost a lot of mana, and we can always, you know, in the later turns, you know, always connive them away if they're not really helpful in the later game, just because some of them do have cast into like a counter ability that your opponent pays 3 mana. They may have like 7 mana out, and it's not really helpful anymore, but definitely, you know, good in the early game. So one card we have in the deck is Consider. Very solid. Look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into the graveyard, and you draw a card. So definitely good. Kind of works well with like Delver. You can maybe look at the top part of your library. If it's a land card that you don't need, throw in the graveyard. Maybe set up for a spell for Delver to flip it. You got Delver Secrets, a 1-mana 1/1 that at the beginning of our upkeep we get to reveal top part of our library. If it's a non-creature card or non-land card, we get to reveal it and essentially turn it into our insect creature that's a 3/2. Definitely very good. This is kind of one of those things we want out early in the game because we want to get this out on turn 1, flip it on turn 2, and then kind of hopefully take over the game that way with the tempo, because swinging for 3 is a lot better than swinging for 1. Couple Fate and Hopes here. You know, 1 mana, bounce something back to opponent's hand. And if its mana value is 3 or less, we get the Scry one, which also helps with like Delver, fix the top cover of our library. Look for possibly a card that either helps flip Delver or get rid of a card that doesn't really help or we don't need, which is definitely very good. Slip out the back, another good 1 mana kind of, you know, protection spell for our cards. We get to put a +1/+1 counter to our target creature, and then it faces out, so it's good against direct removal. It's good against board wipes. You know, definitely a good way to protect creatures we want to keep on the battlefield, and kind of limits on what your opponent can kind of interact with on our side of the board, as it kind of it doesn't come back until after our opponent's turn is over. Spell Pierce, we got a couple copies of this, a 1 mana kind of target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. So kind of like one of those early kind of protection counter spells to kind of protect our things. In the late game, with the connive ability, you can always just throw it away and kind of put a +1/+1 counter on a creature that connived. Still not bad as an early board tempo-y kind of counter spell, which is definitely very good. We have March of the Swirl and Mist, which I believe we do get one in one of the decks that include blue, so having the 1 copy there. Definitely another good card. Kind of works a little bit like Slip Out the Back, but doesn't do the +1/+1 counter. We can tap X and blue, and at additional cost to cast a spell, we may exile a number of cards from our hand, and the spell costs 2 less to cast for each exiled card this way, and up to X target creatures phase out. So our opponent plays a board wipe, we can phase out our whole side of the board by sacrifice or by exiling maybe 1 card. We have 3 things out. We can get rid of maybe pesky creatures our opponent has out on their side of the board, so we can attack into them and possibly finish them off. Definitely a good card, I would say, overall. And, you know, yet again, utilizing not just the cards for what they do face up, but also using them to kind of feed into March is definitely very good in the later game if they're not as effective as they were in the early game. We already went over the Ledger Shredder, but still a great card for this style of deck. We got Make It Disappear as a counter spell that 2 mana, casualty 1, counter target spell unless control pays 2. And if we want to sacrifice a creature, we can counter that spell twice, and they have to pay 4 mana, which is definitely not that bad. Worst case scenario, we just throw it away to a connive ability. We got Mischievous Catgeist, a 2 mana 1/1. When it deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. Has Disturb ability that it turns into an enchantment. That enchanted creature has whenever this creature deals damage to a player, we get to draw a card. And then if we go to the graveyard from anywhere, exile instead. So definitely not another good card to maybe use the connive ability for, because sure, the 1 mana 1/1's not bad, but we can always just throw it away into our graveyard and get to replay it as the enchantment side, which is definitely not that bad there. We got 2 copies of Planar and Incision, 2 mana, exile target artifact or creature, then return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So yet again, kind of like a flicker ability, maybe not as good as like a Slip Out the Back, but just another way to protect the spell. This is more of like if your opponent uses a removal spell, not a board wipe, as it flickers it out of the battlefield. You know, it squishes their spell that they casted on it. The creature now comes back with an additional +1/+1 counter. So definitely pretty decent. Not as good as, like I said, Slip Out the Back, but still not a bad card to have, especially, you know, with us being so budget focused. Security Bypass is another good card, I think. I think you'll see a lot of this card in like these kind of like low to the ground ball style decks, as is a 2 mana enchantment aura that as long as enchanted creatures attack it alone, it can't be blocked. And then whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, it connives. So another card that kind of gives us that little bit of tempo. Kind of works well with a lot of cards in our deck. You can put on Delver Secrets, you can put on the Ledger Shredder, you could even put on our Mischievous Catgeist. So definitely a lot of good cards there. Then we also have Storm Chaser Drake, 2 mana, 2/1 flyer, that whenever it becomes target of a spell we control, we get to draw a card. So if we have to target with a Slip Out the Back, it's going to draw us a card. We get a +1/+1 counter on it. Definitely a good card for tempo. as it helps us kind of, still keep tempo every time we target with a spell. Even if we target with an enchantment, we get to also draw a card, so definitely good there. And then because we are a creature-based deck or a tempo-based deck, we have another counter spell with Essence Capture, 2 mana counter target spell. Our creature spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature we control, so kind of like another good card that helps us with tempo, turns our smaller creatures into bigger creatures, that additional +1/+1 counter. So overall, not that bad of a list. Like I said, very budget-focused, not really anything too crazy here that's super expensive. A lot of cards from a lot of the more recent sets, which is definitely very good. And then a couple cards you can look at for upgrading here is you can maybe add a Suspicious Stowaway, maybe over the Catgeist. Not a bad card here. It can't be blocked naturally. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we have to draw a card and discard a card. It is only a 1/1, but it does create a Nightbound, Daybound cycle here that turns into a 2/1. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player on the night side, we have to just draw a card. We don't have to discard, so still not bad nonetheless. We got Dream Shackle Geist, which would then turn the deck into a 3-mana curve deck. Definitely not a bad card to have in a tempo style deck. It's definitely one that you would see in, I would say, the mono blue tempo deck that's currently around in the meta. It's a 3-mana 3/1. At the beginning of our combat each turn, we have to choose up to 1 target ability, which is either tap target creature or target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So definitely a good way to kind of lock down a creature that you just don't want to attack into, or you don't want your opponent to continue getting the effect of. But nonetheless, still not a bad card. It's definitely one of those things that maybe you cut down in some Storm Chaser Drakes, so a couple of these in there. Maybe you get rid of just maybe some of the other tempo cards, add this in. Still, it's pretty cool to have a creature that has an additional ability that makes it pretty effective in the later game. Add additional copies of March of the Swirl and Mist. This is probably the card I would probably take out the Planar Incursions for, or Incisions for. Add this instead, as it is a great replacement. This kind of works exactly like Slip Out the Back, and not only does it do it, not only do you get penalized, you don't get penalized for doing it to your opponent's creatures. It also can save your butt in a possibility of getting some sort of board wipe ability like a Meathook Massacre or other board wipes abilities in the format. And then the last card here is just Otawara, Sorin City. Probably only need 1 or 2 copies of here. It's a just make some of your additional lands that you may draw in the later game just have an additional ability they can sink your mana into, and helps you kind of control the board state, as you can bounce target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So still not that bad overall. Like I said, still very low to the ground list. I think it's a good list. It's definitely going to be kind of interesting to kind of see how a deck like this works out post rotation. In a format that we'll probably see a lot of Meathook Massacre and stuff like that, but I do think it's a list that will win some games and kind of frustrate your opponent in the process of doing so. So definitely a cool list to definitely check out as well. So the next deck up on the list is going to be an Azorius Spirits deck. Now this is a list I saw someone ask if I can make one for. It's definitely an interesting list. Definitely looks very similar to my mono blue list, but I added some white, so it's Azorius to kind of splash in some of the spirits that we kind of got from Innistrad and kind of and afterwards. So definitely pretty interesting nonetheless. Overall, I think it's another pretty decent list. Playing a couple different cards, trying to put that flavor of spirits into the deck. Just because there aren't too many decent spirits, I would say, that are more on the uncommon and common side. But there are cards that do become spirits if we are able to recast them once they go to the graveyard. The one card that's key to this deck is Catilda. I think it's a great spirit. In the sense that it's a 3-mana XX, that it has flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires, and its power and toughness are equal number of permanents we control that are spirits and or enchantments. So kind of like the key legendary spirit that we could have for a spirits deck. And then on the flip side, we could disturb it for the 5-mana and enchant a creature as flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires. And it gets +X/+X, where its number permanents we control are spirits and or enchantment. And then essentially, if it would then get removed from the battlefield, it gets exiled instead. So definitely still not a bad, card to have for a deck, even on the budget side. Some of the key cards that are a little bit different than our mono blue Delver deck is we have Homestead Courage. That's just another effective card that works very well if we're trying to be very aggressive. A 1-mana sorcery that can put a +1/+1 counter target creature. And then it gains Vigilance, and then we can flash it back for 1 mana. Definitely a very, very strong card. You may have seen it in like the Magecraft decks that are currently in the meta, as it is something that kind of is very cheap, puts +1/+1 counters on things, and it doesn't make our creatures have to tap in order to attack. We have some copies of Fate and Hope in the deck just to kind of bounce things back and kind of get out of our way if we want to attack into our opponent. Of course, because we are playing blue, Slip Out the Back makes it into the list. Definitely a very solid card to add. We also have March of the Swirl and Mist. Yet again, another good card that works just like Slip Out the Back and can also target multiple things and kind of get rid of pesky creatures that are in our way from attacking. Another card that you may see a lot of, not just in Spirits, but another solid 2-drop that I feel like a lot of people overlooked. But you have Fleeting Spirit here. It's a 2-mana 3/1, and we can tap 1 white, exile 3 cards from our graveyard, and it gains first strike at the end of turn, so it becomes a 3/1 for a striker. And on top of that, we can discard a card from our hand, exile Fleeting Spirit, return to the battlefield under someone's control at the beginning of the next end step. So you gotta get another card that will force us to, that if our opponent decides to target it, we can always flicker it off the battlefield and get it back at the end of turn. You know, it's not indestructible. It kind of reminds me of a card that we used to have that was 2 mana. It did kind of the same exact thing, except for the first strike thing. That's kind of an additional ability, but it only cost 2 mana. The only difference was when we discarded a card, it gained indestructible, and this one does, you know, gain an ability to just remove it from the battlefield. So, you know, it's definitely good against like things like Meathook Massacre and board wipes, and also spot removal at the cost of only 1 card. And we do have cards in the deck that have Flashback and Connive, so it's our Disturb, I should say. Definitely a good card to kind of go in hand with cards that we get extra value when they're in our graveyard. I have Spirit and Companion in the deck. Sure, it's an enchantment. It's not a spirit, but it is kind of a card that kind of is a decent 2-drop that allows us to draw a card, as we don't have too many ways outside of a few cards in the deck that help us keep tempo to kind of draw a card. So I added this to the deck, so it's still not bad. Also works very well with like a Catilda because it's an enchantment creature, so not bad there. Catgeist makes the list. Yet again, another cat spirit creature that deals combinations of player. We get to draw a card. We can also discard it to any of our discard abilities and use the Disturb ability that if a creature we control will deal damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So not bad there. Security bypass, yet again, another enchantment that kind of gives one of our creatures that we want to equip it to kind of like a unblockable whenever it attacks alone, and then we get the Connive, so it allows us to kind of keep tempo that way. We have Devoted Graphkeeper, a 2-mana 2/1 that when it enters the battlefield, we get to mill 2 cards, and whenever we cast a spell from our graveyard, we get to tap target creature we don't control, so tapping things down on our opponent's side of the board if we decide to disturb something or flashback something. And then we can disturb him back from the graveyard. It can only block creatures of flying, and if we'd be playing the graveyard from anywhere, you exile instead. It's a 3/1 flyer, so still not bad nonetheless. Like I said, we already have Catilda, yet again another good spirit that kind of works very well here. And then we also have Geist Light Snare, 3 mana counter spell that costs 1 less if you control a spirit and costs 1 less if you control an enchantment. And then counter target spell unless controller pays 3. So in the early game, this is definitely a very effective counter spell that could possibly only be a 1 mana counter spell. At best, it's most likely a 2 mana counter spell. So not bad to round out the list. We have Plains, 8 islands. We have 1 deserted beach, 2 towers, and 4 tranquil coves. Yet again, another list here. You know, we could include more deserted beaches if we want to upgrade that way. There are some other spirits that you could also include if you have them or upgrade into. Spectral Adversary is great for this style list. It's a 2 mana spirit that's a 2/1 that has flash, so we can cast it on our opponent's turn. Then we can dump mana into it as many times as we can pay it, so we can dump 2 mana into it as many times. When it comes to the battlefield, it gets to put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and then up to that many target artifacts, creatures, or enchantments phase out. So kind of a good card to kind of sink some mana into, phase things out until the end of, I believe, the next turn. So definitely not bad there if we really, really want to do that. Get rid of things on our opponent's side of the board, phase them out until maybe their next turn, which is not bad, and we can get an attack in, and then this thing gets bigger. We also have Dennick here. It's another great card that becomes a spirit. On the flip side, it's 2 mana 2/3 with lifelink, and makes it so cards in our graveyard can't be the target of spells or abilities. So if your opponent plays like Trespasser, they can't eat things from the graveyard, which is definitely good. And then we can disturb it, make it a 3/2 with flying, and then whenever one or more creature cards are put into the graveyard from anywhere, investigate. And this ability triggers only once each turn. And then if Dennick would be put into the graveyard from anywhere, it just gets exiled. So definitely a good card. Has 2 different abilities. I do think maybe we'll see a little bit more disturbed. I think it's a pretty okay value ability as you kind of get 2 effects as long as they don't get exiled from the graveyard. Definitely probably replace maybe some Catgeist or the Spirit Companions if we want to add some Dennicks, or even Spectral Adversary. Then we also have Doratha, Vengeful Victim, 2 mana 4/4 flyer spirit that whenever it attacks or blocks, sacrifice at the end of combat. It is a 4/4 and it's a flyer, so maybe your opponent doesn't want to attack into it and kind of lose their creature for only 2 mana. And then for 3 mana, we get to disturb it, and then we get to give enchanted creature the ability that whenever this creature attacks, create a 4/4 spirit creature token with flying that is tapped and attacking, and sacrifice that token at the end of combat. And then if the creature would be put anywhere other than the graveyard or the enchantment, exile instead. So Definitely not bad there. Definitely a very powerful card that kind of works well to kind of, slow down the game very quickly early on, and definitely has a good ability in the later game. We have Jim Shacklegeist, 3 mana, 3/1. It was also my mono blue tempo deck in the upgrade list. This is definitely another solid 3-drop that you can add into this list to kind of slow down what your opponent's doing by locking them down. It's also a spirit, so it works well if you want to be very heavy into spirits. You probably want to cut back on maybe some of the mischievous cat guys to add some of these in. We also have the Patrician Geist, a 3 mana 2/2 flyer. The other spirits we control get +1/+1, and spells we cast from the graveyard cost 1 less to cast, so it makes all our disturb abilities that much cheaper. Our flashback ability is already pretty cheap, and this is definitely one of those things that I would say that what you probably want to do when you're upgrading the deck is you probably want to remove anything that's not a spirit that is in the deck list, as I kind of have a couple of things that aren't spirits, like Companion. Technically, this is not a spirit until replays, so this is definitely another possibility, though I do think the front side of the card is definitely still very good nonetheless. But nonetheless, this is definitely one of those decks that you can upgrade slowly over time. It will definitely be kind of interesting if we get additional spirits, as there aren't too many, I think, that are currently in standard post-rotation, so it's definitely one of those things that will probably be tweaked over time. Maybe you only go down to like 1 Grafkeeper, 1 Denic, and you have a bunch of Dorthras, Dream Shackle Geist, Patriarch Geist, and Spectral Adversaries that kind of take over the other slots of the deck. And then you add a couple additional copies of Deserted Beaches and probably cut down the Tranquil Coves and keep the Skybridge Towers, as it's a card that you can sacrifice in the later game and still draw a card. But nonetheless, a decent, Azorius Spirits deck that I do think will be pretty decent. But nonetheless, it's still something that, as we kind of see how the meta develops, it'll get tweaked over time. So, it's definitely like any of these lists that I kind of post today. As we get into that post rotation, we understand what's in Dominaria. We kind of see how the meta shifts. It's definitely one of those things that maybe this deck will shift as well. I'll probably do a follow-up on any of my budget decks that I'm kind of doing now, as we kind of get a better understanding of how the standard meta kind of shifts overall. But if you liked any of these lists, or kind of want to see other lists that you want me to maybe try to make a build around that maybe have cards from the various sets that we'll still have post-rotation, let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button, definitely helps out a lot. And if you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos like this one, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.